I'm Vivian Locke, 47, and I spent 25 years in the quiet part of the Army, the listening part, rising from an 18-year-old at an intercept console to a colonel they fly across the country when a classified network is being pulled apart. For years I gave that work everything, my sleep, my friendships, most of a marriage, and I did it in windowless rooms where no one ever claps. But when two young techs waved me off in the middle of a breach and mocked the desk lady, not knowing I was the incident commander sent to stop it, I made a choice about who I was going to be in that room. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who never bothered to learn what you actually do? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you are tuning in from. And if you have ever had to stand up for yourself after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe. By the time the sun came up, the breach was over, and no one on that floor would ever mock a desk job in front of me again. I remember standing by a window in a borrowed room near the facility, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour before, watching the light come up gray over a parking lot full of government sedans. I was tired in the way you only get after you have carried something heavy for a long time and finally set it down. And I let myself, just for a minute, go back to the beginning, because a night like that one does not start the night it happens. It starts 25 years earlier, at a console in a windowless room, with a girl nobody expected anything from. I was 18 the first time I put on a headset and listened to a war I could not see. It was 1997, and I had joined the Army because I did not have money for anything else, and because I wanted very badly to be part of something that mattered. They tested me, and the test said I was good at patterns, at languages, at sitting still and paying attention when everyone else had stopped, and so they made me a signals intelligence operator. That is a fancy way of saying I listened. I sat in rooms with no windows and pulled meaning out of noise. And I learned that most of the important things in the world are decided by people who never raise their voices. It was not glamorous. I want to be honest about that because the story I am telling ends with a general handing me a room, and I do not want you to think it was ever easy or expected. For the first years of my career, I was invisible. While other soldiers came home to parades and handshakes, I came home from rooms that did not officially exist, having done work I could never talk about, to people who assumed that because I had not carried a rifle through a village, I had not really been to war. I used to let it bother me. Later, I learned to let it go. But it took a long time, and it took a man named Emmett Prewitt. Sergeant Major Prewitt was the oldest person in the building, and the only one who ever looked at me like I was already what I was going to become. He had spent his whole life in the quiet part of the Army, the listening part, and he had watched 100 bright young people burn out or wash away because nobody told them their work was real. In the year 2000, when I was 21, I pulled a pattern out of a stream of intercept traffic that an entire shift had walked past. It was a small thing, and it was not a small thing. It changed how a mission was run. Prewitt came and stood behind my chair, and he did not smile, because he was not a man who smiled. But he nodded once, slowly, and that nod was worth more to me than any medal. He said something to me that day that I have carried for 25 years. He said, "People think the war is only where the shooting is. The war is wherever the enemy is talking. And right now, in this room, you are the only one listening." Then he told me to stop wasting my talent at the bottom of the rank structure. He told me to go earn a commission, to put myself where I could decide things, because the Army had plenty of people willing to follow and not nearly enough who could see. I did not believe him about myself. But I believed him about the work, so I went. I want to tell you about one deployment, because it is the kind of thing that never makes it into a story about a soldier, and it should. It was early in my career in a place I cannot name, and I spent 90 straight days in a room the size of a shipping container, wearing a headset, listening. There was a convoy route that a unit used every week, and I began to notice a pattern in the traffic around it. A small rhythm, a set of words that repeated in a particular order before certain days. It took me 2 weeks to be sure. When I was sure, I walked my analysis up the chain, and a man I never met changed the convoy's timing based on what I had heard. And the ambush that had been set for that route caught nothing but empty road. I never saw the soldiers whose lives that saved. They never knew my name. They went home to their families and told stories about their deployment, and I was not in any of those stories, and that is exactly how it is supposed to work. That is the deal you make when you choose the quiet part of the war. You save people who will never know you existed, and you learn to let that be enough. Because it has to be. That deployment taught me the second half of what Prewitt started. He taught me that the quiet work was real. The convoy taught me that being unseen was not a punishment, but a feature, that the whole power of what I did came from the fact that the enemy did not know I was listening, and that if I ever needed to be seen and thanked to feel that my work mattered, I was in the wrong line of work. I decided, somewhere in that container, that I would build a career I could be proud of in private, and that I would never again measure the worth of what I did by how loudly the world clapped for it. It is a strange kind of discipline. It made me very good at my job and very hard to insult, and both of those things would matter, decades later, in a room full of alarms. The years after that were a blur of night shifts in schools and deployments to places I still cannot name. I gave the Army everything a person can give. I gave it my 20s, my sleep, most of my friendships, and a marriage that could not survive the schedule. And I did it inside rooms, at keyboards, in front of screens, doing the kind of soldiering that never makes the recruiting posters. I want you to understand that so you understand what the word desk meant to me by the time this story reaches the vault. When someone calls my life a desk job, they are not describing my work. They are describing everything they never bothered to learn about it. I commissioned as a signal officer in 2002 when I was 23 through officer candidate school, and Emmett Prewitt drove 4 hours to watch me get my gold bars pinned on. He stood at the back in his dress uniform, a sergeant major among lieutenants' families, and when it was over he shook my hand like an equal, which from him was almost too much to bear. I made first lieutenant in 2004 and captain in 2006, and by then I was leading a signals company, which meant I was responsible for other people's quiet work as well as my own. And still, every year, in some briefing, some line officer would look at my branch insignia and file me under support. Not a fighter. The help. I could tell you about a dozen of those rooms, but there is one from 2019 that matters for this story, because it is the exact attitude that would meet me in the vault, just wearing a colonel's stars instead of a sergeant's stripes. I was a lieutenant colonel by then, running network defense for a large command, and a decorated infantry officer stood up in a planning meeting and called my section, to my face, in front of 40 people, "The help desk!" He said it like a joke. Everyone laughed the careful laugh people laugh when a senior man makes a joke at someone's expense. I did not argue with him. I have never won an argument by arguing. What I did was let the work answer for me, quietly, over the following months until the same officer was standing in my section asking my analyst to save a mission he had nearly lost. That is how I learned to fight that particular war. Not with words, with results. I remember the exact moment that infantry officer needed my section because it was a lesson in patience that I have never forgotten. It was maybe 4 months after he called us the help desk. A mission he owned had gone sideways because the network it depended on had been quietly degraded, not attacked in any dramatic way, just slowly poisoned until nothing his people relied on could be trusted. He came to my section because he had nowhere else to go, and he stood in the doorway of a room he had mocked, and he asked for help, and I gave it to him, fully, without a single word about what he had said. My analysts found the problem, traced it, and gave him back a network he could trust, and he won his mission because of work he had spent months insisting was not real soldiering. He never apologized. Men like that rarely do. But he never called my section the help desk again, and the next time my branch came up in a briefing, he was quiet. And quiet from a man like that is its own kind of apology. I learned that you do not need people to admit they were wrong. You just need the facts to make the argument for you, over and over, until the words stop. That is the patience the vault would test. Because a lieutenant colonel can afford to play the long game with a peer who insulted her. It is harder, much harder, to hold that same patience when the insult comes from 2 young enlisted soldiers in the middle of a crisis. When the fastest way to answer them is sitting right there in the silver eagle on your shoulder, and every instinct in you wants to reach for it. I had spent my whole career learning not to reach for it. I was about to find out whether the lesson had taken. By 2023, I was a colonel, 44 years old, and I took command of a cyber protection brigade, which is a unit built for exactly one purpose, To be the people you call when the network is already on fire. We were the ones who went into the buildings that were actively being taken apart from the inside and stopped it and figured out how and closed the door. It is the most real fight I have ever been in, and almost no one outside my world knows it happens. That is the life. That is the argument I had been having, quietly, with the whole army since I was 18. And in the spring of 2026, that argument walked me into a room full of alarms and two young men who had no idea who I was. I need to tell you how they train people like me to think, because it explains the mock that is coming, and it explains why I did not need to raise my voice to answer it. In my world, the loudest person in the room is almost never the most dangerous one. The dangerous one is the quiet person reading the traffic, the one who sees the small wrong thing in a sea of normal and understands what it means. For 25 years, I had been that quiet person, and I had watched louder people mistake my silence for slowness, mistake my patience for weakness, mistake my keyboard for a place where nothing brave ever happened. They were always wrong, but they were confident, and confidence is very loud, and the world tends to believe whoever is loudest until the moment the facts arrive. There's a whole culture of that confidence in parts of the military, a belief that if you are not kicking down doors, you are not in the fight. I understand where it comes from. Physical courage is easy to see and easy to honor, and it should be honored. But somewhere along the way, that honor curdled, in some corners, into contempt for everyone whose battlefield does not photograph well. The people who feel that contempt most freely are usually the youngest, the ones who have absorbed the culture but not yet met the reality. They have been told cyber is not a real fight so many times that they believe it. Right up until the day the network they depend on is being pulled apart and none of their door kicking is any use at all. That is a hard day for a young soldier. I was about to watch two of them have it at once. The call came at midnight. I want to be precise about the hour because people who have never done this work imagine it happens on a schedule. It does not. The secure phone by my bed rang a little after 12, and a voice I trusted told me that a hostile actor was inside a signals intelligence network at a joint cyber facility several states away, that classified data was moving out of the building in real time, and that the on-site team had been fighting it for the better part of an hour and was losing. They needed an incident commander. They needed someone who had done this before, at scale, under pressure, and who could walk into a room that was already failing and take the fight without dropping it. They needed me. So they were sending a plane. You do not get calls like that for a help desk. You get them when the building is on fire and the people already inside have run out of ideas. I have gotten enough of them over the years that my body knows the drill before my mind is fully awake. I was packed in 4 minutes. I keep a bag ready for exactly this. I did not have time to think about how I looked, and I want you to hold on to that detail because it matters later. There was no dress uniform, no display of rank, no time to be impressive. There was a clean, plain uniform, a go bag, a cup of gas station coffee, and a dark runway. Whatever the people at that facility were picturing when they heard an incident commander was coming, it was not going to be a tired woman in an unremarkable uniform walking in without ceremony, which is exactly how it played out. My aide, Captain Noor Haddad, met me at the aircraft. Noor is 34, sharp as a blade, and has been reading me situations for 2 years, without once telling me what I want to hear, instead of what is true. On the flight, she gave me the fragmentary picture, the little we knew, the shape of the problem, an intrusion into a trusted network, data leaving, a watch floor of good people who had been punched in the mouth by something they did not see coming and were now swinging wildly at it. I closed my eyes for most of the flight, not to sleep, but to get quiet, because the first thing that dies in a room like the one I was flying toward is quiet, and someone has to bring it back. They are scared, Near said, near the end. They are, I said. That is the most dangerous thing in the building right now, more dangerous than whoever is in the network. I have learned that fear makes smart people stupid, faster than anything else. My whole job in the first 10 minutes would be to lower the temperature. I did not yet know that 2 of the people in that room were going to make it very hard to do quietly. We landed a little before 4 in the morning, and a car took us to the facility, and I badged through more doors than I can count, down into the part of the building where the real work lives. The SIGINT vault is a secure room, low-lit on purpose, walls lined with consoles, the kind of place that has no windows and no clocks, and no sense of the world outside the mission. I have spent my life in rooms like it. Walking in felt like coming home if home were on fire. The alarms were not loud, which surprises people. In my world, the alarms are soft and constant, a low, insistent chirping, screens washed red, the visual language of a system telling you it is bleeding. And it was bleeding. I could read the room in 3 seconds. Trusted traffic that was not trusted. Data leaving through a door that was supposed to be locked. A watch floor of a dozen people all leaning toward 2 consoles at the front where the fight was hottest. At those 2 consoles were the 2 young men this story's really about. Sergeant Bryce Kettner, 27, and Specialist Colby Reinhardt, 24. I did not know their names yet. What I knew was what I could see, which was 2 frightened operators talking over each other, blaming each other, hammering at keys without a plan, doing the cyber equivalent of shooting in every direction because the enemy was somewhere in the dark. They were not bad soldiers. I want to say that now, because I am not telling you the story to make them villains. They were young and undertrained and terrified, and they had been told their whole short careers that they were not really in a fight. And now they were in the fight of their lives, and no one had prepared them for it. But what they did next was still their choice. I walked up to the 2 of them, quietly, the way I walk into every room, and I asked to see the traffic. "That is all," I said. "Show me what you are seeing." I did not announce myself. I have learned that announcing yourself in a crisis wastes time and makes it about you instead of the problem. I wanted to see the packets. Kettner did not even look at me fully. He half turned, took in a tired woman in a plain uniform standing behind his chair, and waved me off with the back of his hand, the way you shoo away someone who has wandered into the wrong meeting. "Wrong room, ma'am," he said. "Desk jobs are upstairs. This is the real work down here, and we do not have time to walk you through it." Reinhardt laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, exactly. It was the nervous laugh of a young man who was drowning and had decided the safest thing to do was act like he was not. "The paperwork's on the 2nd floor," he said. "We've got this. Promise." And the 2 of them turned back to their screens, to the fight they were losing, having just told the incident commander the army had flown across the country that she would not understand the grown-up work happening down here. I have been underestimated by experts. Truly, I have been dismissed by people far more senior and far more skilled than Sergeant Kettner. But there is a particular quiet that comes over you when the people who are failing at your job turn around and tell you that you could not possibly understand it. It is not anger. Anger is loud, and I am not loud. It is something colder and clearer than anger. It is the feeling of the whole thing coming into focus. In that moment, I stopped being tired. Everything Prewitt ever taught me lined up in a single straight line, and I knew exactly what to do. And it was not to argue. I did not correct them. I did not pull rank. I did not say a word about who I was. There was an open terminal at the end of the row, dark, unused, waiting. I walked to it, set my badge down on the desk beside it, sat, and logged in. And while the 2 of them kept talking over each other about the enemy they could not find, I started reading the actual traffic. Not the alarms, the traffic itself, the raw packets. Because alarms tell you that something is wrong, and I did not need to be told something was wrong. I needed to see the thing itself, the small wrong shape hiding inside all the normal, the way I had been trained to see it when I was younger than either of them. It took me about 90 seconds. I want to be honest that 90 seconds is fast, and it was fast because I have done this for 25 years, not because it was easy. What I saw was elegant, in the way the dangerous things are elegant. The intruder was not smashing through the front door. They were hiding their theft inside traffic the system already trusted, riding out of the building on the back of a maintenance account that the network had been taught to wave through without looking, exactly the way Kettner had waved me through without looking. The exfiltration was moving through a channel everyone on that floor had been trained to ignore because it was supposed to be safe. That is why they could not find it. They were looking for a break-in. There was no break-in. There was a trusted door standing open, and something walking out of it in a uniform the network recognized. So I closed the door. I isolated the segment, cut the path, and severed the account's trust in a handful of commands, and the screen that had been bleeding red for an hour went dark and quiet. The chirping stopped. The data stopped moving. The room, which had been a wall of overlapping panic, fell into a silence so sudden it had a texture. Kettner stopped typing. Reinhardt turned. A dozen people who had been leaning toward the front of the room straightened up and looked at the one terminal where the noise had ended, and at the stranger sitting behind it with her badge lying face down on the desk beside her hand. For a moment, nobody said anything. In my experience, that is the truest moment in any room like this one. The second right after the thing everyone was fighting simply stops, and no one has yet understood why. I did not fill the silence. I let them look. Kettner's eyes went from the dark screen to my hands to my face, and I watched something start to happen behind his expression. The first cold suspicion that he had made a mistake he could not take back. And that was when the door at the back of the vault opened and Brigadier General Harmon Vega walked in. Vega is 54, silver at the temples, a man who has run this kind of facility long enough that he does not waste motion. He had flown in the same night from a different direction, and he came through the door, still shaking off the cold, and the first thing he did was look at the big screen on the wall, the one that showed the network's health, and see that the bleeding had stopped. Then he looked at the room to find out who had stopped it. His eyes moved across the watch floor, past the 2 hot seats, and landed on me at the terminal in the corner. And his whole posture changed. Not dramatically, just a small, definite shift, the shift of a senior man recognizing the officer he had been waiting for. "Colonel Locke," he said, and his voice carried in the new quiet the way a normal voice carries in a room where everyone has stopped breathing. "You made good time." He walked to the center of the floor and turned so the whole room could hear him. "This is Colonel Vivian Locke. She is your incident commander. As of right now, everyone in this room works her problem. She has the floor." And then, because he is the kind of officer who notices things, he added, looking at the dark terminal, "Looks like she has already started. I have thought a great deal since that night about the sound a room makes when the truth arrives. It is not loud. It is the opposite of loud. It is the sound of a dozen small assumptions collapsing at once, and no one wanting to be the first to move." Bryce Kettner had gone the color of the walls. He was looking at my shoulder now, at the silver eagle he had not bothered to see when he waved me off, and at the name Vega had just said out loud, the name of the incident commander he had told to go find the paperwork upstairs. Beside him, Reinhardt had put a hand over his mouth without seeming to know he had done it. The two of them had spent the last hour losing a fight they did not understand, and had spent the last 5 minutes mocking the one person in the building who could win it, and now they were watching that person be handed the entire room. I stood up. I picked up my badge and clipped it where everyone could see it, not to make a point, but because it was time to be the commander now, and the commander does not hide her name. Captain Haddad had come in behind Vega, and she moved to the watch officer, a captain who had been running the floor, and quietly confirmed who I was and what my authority was, and I watched the watch officer come to attention when he understood. He had not mocked me. He had just been drowning like the rest of them. I gave him a small nod to tell him we were past that now, that there was work to do, and that he was still part of it. But I did not look at Kettner and Reinhardt. Not yet. And I want to tell you why, because it is the heart of who I decided to be in that room. It would have been so easy to look at them. One look, in that silence, with the general standing there and my name still hanging in the air, would have finished them in front of everyone. They were braced for it. I could feel them braced for it. The way you brace for a blow you know is coming and know you have earned. And I understood, standing there, that the cruelest thing I could do and the easiest thing I could do were the same thing, and that both of them were beneath the work. There was a network to harden. There was an intruder to understand. There were classified secrets to account for. The room did not need me to settle a score. It needed me to command. So I gave the two of them nothing, which in that moment was the loudest thing I could have given them, and I turned to the floor and started to work. "Here is what we know," I said, and my voice was flat and even, the debrief voice, the voice that tells a scared room that the adult has arrived and the panic is over. The exfiltration is contained. It is not gone. Contained means the bleeding stopped, not that we understand the wound. I need 3 things, in this order, and I need them now. And I gave the 3 things, clean and specific, and I watched the room reorganize itself around a plan, which is the fastest way to kill fear I have ever found. Give frightened people a clear task, and their hands stop shaking. Within 2 minutes, the vault had gone from a wall of noise to a working floor. People bent to specific jobs, the crisis turning from a monster in the dark into a problem with edges. The first task was to make sure the door I had closed stayed closed. Containment is fragile in the first hour, and a smart intruder will test the walls the moment they feel them go up, looking for another way out. So I put 2 of the steadier analysts on watch for exactly that, told them to call out the instant they saw the account try anything. And I set a second layer of monitoring behind the first, because in my experience, the enemy always has a backup plan, and the only question is how fast you find it. The second task was to understand what had already left the building, which is a grim kind of accounting, going back through the traffic to measure the size of the wound. And the third task, the one that mattered most for the future, was to figure out how the trusted door had been left open in the first place. Because a breach you do not understand is a breach that will happen again next week through the same hole. I moved around the floor as they worked, reading over shoulders, asking short questions, adjusting. This is the part of command that no one teaches you and that cannot be faked. You are not doing the work anymore. You are holding the shape of it in your head, all of it at once, every thread, and you are keeping a dozen frightened people pointed in the same direction without letting any of them feel the fear you are managing. I kept my voice low and even the entire time. When one of the analysts found something and started to get loud with the excitement of it, I brought the volume back down with a hand and a word, because a floor takes its temperature from its commander, and I wanted this floor cold and clear. Prewitt used to say that panic is contagious, and so is calm, and that a good commander is just a person who has decided to be the calm one on purpose. I had decided. I kept Kettner and Reinhardt close, and I kept them on the smallest, most menial support tasks I could find. Fetch me this log. Pull that record. Watch this screen and tell me the second a number changes. I did it deliberately. Not to punish them, though I will not pretend there was no part of me that felt the justice of it. I did it because they had just proven they could not be trusted with anything larger, and because the best thing I could do for 2 young soldiers, who had failed, was to put them somewhere they could watch competence up close and learn what it actually looked like. Kettner did the tasks stiffly, his jaw tight, humiliated. Reinhardt did them with his whole attention, watching everything I did. And I filed that difference away, because in my experience, it is the truest tell there is. When you humble a person, some of them get to work, and some of them get to sulking, and the ones who get to work are the ones worth saving. There was a third young soldier who mattered, and I had noticed her earlier without letting on. Specialist Ren Delgado, 23, an analyst who had been sitting a row back from the 2 hot seats. When I first walked up and asked to see the traffic when Kettner waved me off, Delgado had quietly turned her own screen toward me, an inch, an offer, the only person in the room who had made room for a stranger in a plain uniform. At the time, I had only registered it in passing. Now, as I built the response, I found myself giving her real work, and she took it and did it well, fast and careful at once. And I understood that in a room full of people, one of them had done the whole job right without knowing anyone was watching. That is the person you want, not the one who is loud, the one who makes room. Kettner tried to apologize about an hour in. I will give him that much. He came to the edge of my terminal during a lull, stood 2 straight, and said, "Colonel, about earlier. I did not know who you were." I am sorry. And I understood what he was really saying, which was that he was sorry he had mocked a colonel, not that he had mocked a stranger, and those are very different apologies. So I gave him the only answer that was any use to him. I said, "I do not need you sorry, Sergeant. I need you competent. It should not matter who I am. You waved off help in the middle of a breach because you decided you already knew everything worth knowing. That is the thing to be sorry for. Now watch, and do not touch anything until I tell you to." He swallowed and went back to his post. I do not know if it landed. You never do, in the moment. But I had said the true thing, and the true thing is all you can offer. The forensic picture came together over the next few hours, and it told a story that was, in a way, sadder than a clever enemy. The intruder had not been a genius. They had been patient, and they had used a maintenance account that should have been watched and was not. The kind of trusted door gap that a well-run watch floor catches in the first 10 minutes because someone notices that a routine account is doing an unroutine thing. The signs had been there the whole hour Kettner and Reinhardt were fighting. They had been looking for a dramatic break-in because a dramatic break-in was the only kind of attack they believed in, and so they had stared straight through the quiet, ordinary, devastating truth. The enemy had walked out the front door wearing a badge the network trusted, and nobody had been trained to distrust the badge. I sat with that account for a while, tracing it back, and the more I learned, the more it looked like the kind of gap that exists in 100 buildings exactly like this one. The maintenance account had broad permissions because maintenance work needs broad permissions, and it was old, and it had been set up years ago by people who were long gone, and no one had ever gone back to ask whether it still needed to be able to do everything it could do. It was a door that had been unlocked so long that everyone had forgotten it was a door at all. They walked past it every day. It was furniture, and an intruder patient, enough to find it, had simply used it the way it was designed to be used, which is the hardest kind of attack to catch, because nothing about it looks like an attack. There are no alarms for a trusted account behaving like a trusted account. There's only a human being paying enough attention to notice that a routine thing is happening at an unroutine time, in an unroutine amount, and asking why. That human being is the whole point of a watch floor. Not the tools. The tools are necessary, and the tools are not enough. The tools tell you when something breaks the rules, and the best attacks never break the rules. They follow the rules all the way out the door with your secrets in their arms. The only defense against that is a person who knows the normal so well that the abnormal, however quiet, however rule-following, snags on their attention like a thread on a nail. Building people like that takes years. You cannot buy them and you cannot rush them. And a culture that tells those people their work is a desk job, that the real soldiers are elsewhere, is a culture actively dismantling its own last line of defense. One discouraged young analyst at a time. That detail sat with me because it was the whole argument of my life in miniature. The reason the breach ran so long was not that the enemy was brilliant. It was that a room full of people had been taught to equate danger with noise, and so they could not see a danger that was quiet. They were looking for a fight that looked like a fight. And the real fight, the one that actually mattered, was happening in the traffic, in the trusted channel, in the boring account nobody thought was worth watching. In the exact place people like me have been trying to tell people like them to look for 25 years. General Vega convened the after-action review later that morning, once the network was stable and the immediate danger had passed. I have sat through a great many of those reviews, and they are usually where the real damage of a bad night gets done, because a scared organization looking for someone to blame will always find the two people closest to the failure and stop there. The timeline was projected on the screen. It showed in cold detail that the exfiltration had run for nearly an hour, and that the two operators in the hot seats had missed every one of the early signs. Every eye in the room understood what that meant for Kettner and Reinhardt. And Vega, quite properly, turned to me and asked for my assessment as the incident commander. I could have buried them. I want to be honest that the thought was available to me, sitting right there, easy to pick up. They had humiliated me in front of a room, and now the room was mine. And a single hard sentence from me would have ended both of their careers with the general's blessing. Everyone was braced for me to say it. Kettner was staring at the table. Reinhardt's hands were flat on his knees. And I looked at the timeline, and I thought about Emmett Pruitt and about all the good young people I had watched get thrown away by organizations that needed a name to blame more than they needed the truth. And I decided to tell the truth instead. The two hot seat operators missed the early indicators, I said. That is a fact, and it is on the timeline. But if we stop the analysis there, we will fix nothing, and we will lose two soldiers we spent years training. The reason they missed it is that this entire watch floor was built to hunt for break-ins and was never trained to distrust a trusted account. That is not a two-person failure. That is a training failure and a policy failure that happened to land on the two people in the chairs. Pull them off the floor, yes. Retrain them, absolutely. But retrain the whole watch. And close the maintenance account gap at every facility that has it, because I promise you, it is not only here. I watched Vega listen, and I watched him agree, because he is a serious man, and it was the serious answer. There was a silence in the room after I said it, and it was a different silence than the one in the vault. In the vault, the silence had been shock. This one was something closer to relief, though no one would have named it that. I think a lot of the people around that table had been braced for a bloodletting, had assumed that the incident commander, who had been mocked and then vindicated, would want her pound of flesh, and when it became clear that I did not, the whole room let out a breath it had been holding. Kettner looked up from the table for the first time. He did not say anything, but something in his face had shifted. Not to gratitude, not yet, but to confusion. The confusion of a young man who had built a story in which I was the enemy and was now watching that story fail to hold together. I had refused to be the villain he needed me to be in order to keep believing he had only been embarrassed. That is a harder thing to sit with than a punishment. A punishment lets you stay angry. Mercy makes you think. Vega closed the review by ordering exactly what I had recommended. The whole watch would be retrained, not just the two in the chairs. The maintenance account gap would be documented and pushed up the chain so that every facility in the network could close it before an intruder found it there too. And the two hot seat operators would be pulled, reviewed, and given a path back. It was, I thought, walking out of that room, the rarest thing I have seen an organization do under pressure, which is to look at a failure honestly enough to fix the system instead of just naming a culprit. It happened because a general was willing to hear it, and because the person he asked chose to tell the truth instead of taking the easy revenge. Both of those things had to be true. On a different night, with a different commander in my chair, 2 young soldiers would have been quietly destroyed, and the real hole would have stayed open, and everyone would have gone home feeling that justice had been done. That is the version of that morning that usually happens. I am glad it is not the one that did. It would have been easy to bury them. I keep coming back to that, because I think it is the part of the night I am most at peace with. I have watched a culture tell young soldiers that cyber is not a real fight, and then act shocked when those same soldiers are not ready for the real fight when it comes. The floor failed Kettner and Reinhardt long before Kettner and Reinhardt failed the floor. The whole system had told them the quiet work was beneath them, and then handed them the quiet work with no warning and no preparation, and then wanted to punish only them when it went wrong. I was not going to be one more person in that chain. I would hold them accountable, fully, but I would hold the system accountable too, which is harder and rarer, and the only thing that actually prevents the next breach. So they were pulled off the mission floor, both of them, pending retraining and review. That is a real consequence, and it should be, but it was a consequence with a road back attached to it, which is different from a firing squad. And here's where the two of them, who had made the same mistake at the same time in the same room, began to travel very different roads, because character is not what you do in the crisis. Character is what you do in the weeks after, when no one is flying in to save you and the only thing left to fix is yourself. Reinhardt went back into the retraining pipeline, and, to his enormous credit, actually changed. He started asking real questions. He found me before I left the facility and asked not for forgiveness but for advice, which is a much more useful thing to ask for. He wanted to know how I had seen the exfiltration path so fast, and instead of being embarrassed by the answer, he wanted to learn it. I told him what Prewitt told me, in my own words. I told him that the enemy is almost never where the noise is, that the noise is usually where the enemy wants you to look, and that the whole discipline of our work is learning to find the boring true thing behind the loud false one. He wrote it down. A young man who 2 nights earlier had laughed at the paperwork on the 2nd floor was writing down a lesson about patience. And I thought, there it is. That is the one who makes it. Kettner went the other way, at least at first. He stayed defensive. In his mind, the story of that night was that he had been embarrassed, not that he had been wrong. And as long as that was the story, there was nothing for him to learn, because embarrassment is something that is done to you, and being wrong is something you did. I did not chase him. That is a thing you learn commanding people. You can hold the door open, but you cannot walk a person through it. And the ones who insist on standing in the hallway convinced they were treated unfairly will set their own ceiling, and it is not your job to raise it for them. I gave Kettner the same fair path I gave Reinhardt. What he did with it was his to decide. Last I heard, he was still deciding. The person I did chase, in the best sense of the word, was Ren Delgado. Before I left, I found the young analyst who had turned her screen toward a stranger, and I told her I was requesting her for my brigade. She looked at me like I had made a mistake. She was a specialist, junior, quiet, the kind of soldier who does the whole job right and assumes no one notices, because in most rooms, no one does. "Why me, Colonel?" she asked, and I told her the truth. Because when the room was on fire and a stranger asked for help, you were the only person who made room. Everyone else was too busy being right or being scared. You just quietly helped. That is the entire job, specialist. The rest of it is technique, and technique can be taught. What you did cannot. Come learn the rest of it. She said yes. Of course she said yes. I sat with her for a few minutes before I flew out, and I passed on the thing Prewitt had passed to me, because that is the only kind of immortality people in my line of work get. I told her that she was going to spend her career in rooms with no windows, doing work she could never fully explain to the people she loved, and that some of those people would call it a desk job, and that she should let them, because the ones who need to know what she really does will always know, and the rest do not matter. I told her the war is wherever the enemy is talking, and that she was going to be one of the few people in the world who could hear it. She was 23 years old, sitting very straight, and I could see it land the way it had landed in me at that age. The moment a young person realizes their quiet aptitude is not a limitation, but a weapon. I have thought about why Wren mattered to me so much, more than the breach itself in some ways, and I think it is because she was the answer to the whole night. Kettner and Reinhardt were the problem. The two young soldiers a broken culture had produced, taught to sneer at the work before they understood it. Wren was the proof that the culture did not have to win. Nobody had told her to make room for a stranger. Nobody had trained the reflex into her. She had simply looked at a person who needed help, in a room where everyone else was too busy being right, and she had turned her screen an inch. And that instinct, that plain human decency under pressure, is the thing you cannot teach and cannot buy and cannot afford to lose. I had spent 25 years watching the army almost lose people like her, watching them get discouraged and quiet and eventually just leave, taking their irreplaceable instincts with them, because no one ever told them what they were worth. I was not going to lose this one. Pulling her onto my brigade was, I told myself, a personnel decision, but it was also the most selfish thing I did all week, because a commander is only ever as good as the people she can see, and I had just found one that most people would have walked right past. The breach was fully closed by the end of that day. The stolen data assessment came back over the following week, and it was far smaller than it should have been, because the exfiltration had been cut early instead of late. Vega told me plainly what my 90 seconds had saved. He put a number on it, a number I cannot repeat, and the number was large, and it was the difference between a bad night and a catastrophe. He said it the way serious men say serious things, without drama, which made it land harder. 90 seconds, 25 years of learning to see the quiet thing, spent in a minute and a half, to save something I am not allowed to describe. That is the job. It has always been the job. On the flight home, Noor and I sat in the kind of tired quiet that only exists between two people who have done a hard thing well and have nothing left to prove to each other. She said after a while, "You did not look at them, the two texts, when Vega gave you the floor. You never looked at them." And I said, "I know." And she said, "Why not?" And I thought about it because it deserved a real answer. "Because looking at them would have made it about me," I said. And it was never about me. It was about the network. The second I made it about being right, I would have stopped being the commander and started being the person they thought I was. The one who needs to prove something. I have spent 25 years not being that person. I was not going to become her in the one room where it mattered most. Noor nodded and looked out the window, and neither of us said anything else for a long time. A few weeks later, a message reached me from Reinhardt. He had passed his retraining. He wrote that he understood now, that he thought about that night constantly, that he could not believe he had waved off help in the middle of a breach because he had decided a tired woman in a plain uniform could not possibly matter. He wrote that he would spend the rest of his career being the person who makes room. I read it twice. I did not need it, but I was glad to have it, the way you are glad when a lesson you tried to teach turns out to have been received. The desk was never a desk. The war was always wherever the enemy was talking. And one more young soldier had learned to listen. I did not get a parade for that night. I want you to understand that, because I think it is the point. There was no ceremony, no crowd, no moment where the two men who mocked me were made to apologize in front of everyone while I stood there vindicated. That is not how my world works, and after 25 years I would not want it to. Recognition in my line of work is quiet, when it comes at all, and it comes from the small number of people who actually understand what happened. General Vega sent me a short note, a few weeks on, thanking me. It was 3 sentences long. It sits in a drawer, and it means more to me than anything that could have been said out loud in that vault, because it came from a man who knew exactly what my 90 seconds cost me to be able to spend. Back at my brigade, life went on the way it does. And one afternoon, I stood at the back of a training floor and watched Specialist Ren Delgado run a problem, a hard one, the kind we use to see who has it and who only thinks they do. She worked it clean. She did not panic. She did not chase the noise. She found the quiet, wrong thing hiding in all the normal traffic, and she closed the door on it, and she did it without once looking up to see if anyone was watching. I stood there in the doorway, and I saw Emmett Prewitt standing behind a 21-year-old's chair a lifetime ago, nodding once, slowly. The lesson was alive. It had moved one more generation down the line, from a keyboard to a keyboard, and that, more than any number Vega ever put on that night, was the thing I had actually saved. I have thought a lot about why that night settled something in me that 100 other nights did not. I think it is because for once the whole argument of my life played out inside a single room, in a single hour. The mock and the answer, the contempt and the truth, the loud false thing and the quiet real thing, standing right next to each other, and the quiet real thing winning, not with a speech, but with 90 seconds and a closed door. I did not need Kettner to be sorry. I did not need Reinhardt to write to me. I did not need Vega's note, though I keep it. What I needed, it turns out, I had already given myself 25 years ago, when I believed a sergeant major who told me the quiet work was the real work, and I built a life around it, and then one night I got to prove it beyond any argument, and then I got to go home. So here is what I want to leave you with, whoever you are, whatever your quiet, essential job might be. There are people all around you doing work you will never see, holding up things you do not know are being held up, fighting fights that do not photograph well and do not make the news and do not come home to parades. Some of them will be dismissed their whole lives by people who never bothered to learn what they actually do. If you are one of those people, I want you to know that the ones who need to understand your work will always understand it, and the applause you're not getting was never the point. And if you are ever tempted to look at someone quiet, in a plain uniform, in the wrong-looking room and decide they could not possibly matter, do yourself a favor. Ask to see the traffic. You never know who just walked in. If you have ever spent your career doing quiet work that other people wrote off as a desk job, only to be the one who mattered most when it counted, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Do you think I was right to keep those 2 young soldiers instead of burying them in the after-action? Would you have stayed as calm as I tried to, or would you have pulled rank the second they laughed at you? And have you ever been the person who quietly made room for a stranger when everyone else was too busy being right? Tell me, I read them. If this story hit home, hit subscribe, and I will see you in the comments.